All right, you want to just talk to me or see how it...
Hello.
Nice. What's your name?
Laura.
And what's your role at NPS?
I'm a 5th grade teacher.
And can you tell us why you're on strike?
The biggest reason I'm on strike is I really believe in the living wages for ESPs. I think the ESPs are so necessary in our schools. They're our backbone. They're like, many of them are like from our community. They bring so much community wealth to our school. And many of them are making not a livable wage right now.
Hell yeah, thank you so much. Peace. Hey, good to see you. Could you say your name for us?
Mark Robinson.
And what brings you out today to the picket line?
We're here to hold the line.
Absolutely.
Hold the line.
I'm an ESP.
Keep it loud. Keep it proud.
Why are y'all on strike?
We're on strike because it's overdue. For so long, they've been stomping their feet and taking their time, and we haven't been paid what we're supposed to be paid. So right now, we are here as two unions, MFT and ESP, to hold the line.
Awesome. Hey, all salute in solidarity to you all. That's awesome. Thank you so much. Can you say your name for us?
Jabari Brown.
And what's your relationship to the strike?
I'm a special ed teacher at Sanford Middle School.
Oh, wow. Can you tell us why are you all on strike?
We're on strike for safe and stable schools, more mental health support for teachers, living wages for ESPs.
If you wanted to say anything to any words of encouragement to ESPs and teachers who are out on strike, what do you say to people to keep them to hold the line?
Just keep holding the line. We're gonna get something done that's fair for everybody.
Absolutely beautiful. Hey, thank you so much, man. This is so inspiring. Hell yeah. Could you say your name for us?
Yes, Robin Wansley.
And what brings you out today?
I'm out here supporting and representing with our educators, especially, as a city council member. I think it's important that city officials demonstrate that, we have a commitment to making sure that every worker in the city know that they can exercise their rights. Like, be it strike, be it picket, whatever the case is, like, you deserve equitable workplace conditions, and you also deserve to work in places that's actually helping support the collective well-being of our full community.
Absolutely. Hey, what did teachers mean in your life?
Teachers, man, it's why I'm here. Education is literally the reason why I get to sit in this seat in City Hall. Like, educators, taking the time to be my second parent, like feeding me, making sure I got into like after school programs and educational opportunities, like making sure like, I knew I was worthy and I had potential to do so much, to give back to my own community, and they invested in me.
Hey, what's up, y'all? This is GP Jacob. We're out here, the Money Power Land Solidarity Podcast. We're at the community support picket. It's Wednesday right now. I'm in front of the Davis Center on Broadway in Girard in North Minneapolis, and it's absolutely packed. We got teachers, students, parents. You hear the band in the background. I'm talking to people out here to hear why the teachers are on strike, why the ESPs are on strike. Thanks for tuning in.
I'ma work for it, ride for it, I'ma organize for it, stay up in the night and in the morning, I'ma rise for it, heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it, peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it, work for it, ride for it, I'ma organize for it, stay up in the night and in the morning, I'ma rise for it, heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it, peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it.
Hey, peace. Thanks for tuning in to the Money Power Land Solidarity Podcast. I am really honored today to be talking with somebody that is a part of this really inspirational and really important for our city educator strike, the teachers and the ESPs who are out on strike in Minneapolis. We are joined today by Max Hopland, who wrote a great piece kind of contextualizing the strike. So just want to give you a warm welcome. Thanks for coming on the show, Max.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Hell yeah. Before we get into the piece that you wrote, I wanted to just ask you, could you share, like, what is your role as an education support professional? Like, what do you do in the schools, and why are you out on strike?
Yeah, I personally am a special education assistant. I work in a classroom that is for students kindergarten through second grade, and it's what's called the level 3 setting with students with developmental and cognitive disabilities. So that includes a lot of students with Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, stuff like that. And the special ed assistants are there to just help the students through the day, help with the teachers, help make sure the students have everything they need. A lot of students have complex needs, and special ed assistants are kind of the main direct forms of support that a lot of those students have throughout the day.
Hell yeah. Yeah, it's such incredibly important work. Like I've never worked during the school day in the public schools, but I helped to run an after school program for several years and got to know some ESPs, and my brother actually is an ESP. So I really can't stress enough how much respect I have for ESPs and how important ESPs are. And with you doing that work, like, what are the issues that led you all to vote for a strike?
Yeah, I'd say for ESPs, the number one issue has been pay. For a number of years, just ESPs in general make a lot less than teachers, for example. And ESP wages, I've kind of looked into this some myself to kind of figure out what's going on. But kind of over the last 20 years, there's been a lot of wage erosion, a lot of raise. We get our raises negotiated in our collective bargaining agreement every couple of years. And a lot of those raises have just been below inflation. And it's just kind of like wore down to the point where ESPs are just making considerably less money now than they were 20 years ago.
Wow. Yeah, I think that's something that in the U.S. we don't even really have a context for, because there's not much, class consciousness or like public consciousness around unions and collective bargaining. But to realize, like, so not only have y'all not got a raise, but you've actually been taking pay cuts, doing this incredibly important work for really. And then, like, my understanding is that like an ESP wage is like really tough to make it on. It's damn near poverty wages.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, and one big problem for a lot of people too is that a lot of these ESP jobs do not offer full hours. Don't even have the options to have full hours. So that was one of the contract demands, was to have more available hours for those who needed it. There's the union has done surveys of the membership, and I think it's most ESPs have second and even third jobs to kind of make ends meet with this position because they need the extra hours. So the extra hours are really important for a lot of ESPs. At the same time, some ESPs like working fewer than a full work week. Maybe they have, responsibilities at home that they're able to manage when they're working 30 hours a week, stuff like that. But yeah, the wages kind of going down over years and then getting hours kind of gradually decreased has just put a lot of stress on ESPs as a whole in a way that I think kind of boiled over leading up to the strike.
Hell yeah. Could you talk about, like, you talked about, like, the demand for full-time work for those who want it. What are the other demands that the ESPs are making? And then can you talk about how the ESPs relate to the teachers in this strike? Like, I'm a little bit confused. Like, are y'all in the same union, or is it different bargaining units?
Yeah. So ESPs and teachers are both part of the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers. So it's a single union, but we're two chapters of the same union.
Okay.
Which is kind of a confusing structure for everybody, but that's the way it's set up. So we have each chapter of the ESPs and the teachers have separate executive boards that kind of govern the respective bodies, but then the executive board makes a lot of decisions together. There's joint executive boards between the two chapters every month where they make decisions together that affect the whole union. So we're like together mostly, but also separate in some ways in a way that, it's kind of hard to keep track of.
No, I feel you. And what else? What other demands are ESPs making in this strike? Yeah,
so definitely the top demand was wages and hours. The other demands being made in the strike as a whole a lot of them are more directly related to the teacher demands, but some of them are indirectly very important for ESPs too. Like, one of the main demands has been mental health supports for students. And of course that affects everybody in the schools, from teachers to ESPs. And mental health supports, what that looks like is, social workers, counselors, therapists, that kind of stuff, just with all the trauma that so many students have gone through from the pandemic and all the scars that's left. There's just a lot of added challenges in the schools right now. And we just, the union and the membership thought it was just really important that we get these resources for our students, just to make everybody's lives better at school. And this is again, not directly not a direct ESP demand, because ESP, because social workers and counselors aren't on like aren't on the ESP contract, they're on the teacher contract, but it's certainly a demand that affects ESPs greatly and in a less direct way.
Certainly, yeah, and I think that's one of like the really important things about you all standing up and striking together is like making it clear that like we're a community, and what affects teachers affects students, and what affects students affects ESPs, and it's like really a strike beyond just like your very valid and righteous wage demands, which also affect the students, but it's really about public education. It's about the public interest, you know. So it really goes beyond this idea of like, you know, economic, just purely my self-interest, to like, no, we're fighting for what our families need and what our communities need. So that's been a really inspiring, I feel like, a lesson for a lot of people.
Yeah, definitely. No, it's been a huge part of the strike, and I think something that motivates a lot of people to participate.
You want to say your name?
My name is Zareya Fabumi.
Awesome. And are you a student at MPS?
I am, yeah.
Awesome. Why are you out today supporting the strike?
Today I'm out here supporting the strike because specifically within my school, I really want to see more equitable resource distribution, and I want my school to feel like it's been seen and it's been heard within the South Minneapolis community. And I think specifically when you think with whether you're looking at the average like household income between houses and the neighborhoods that some of these South Minneapolis schools are in, you're seeing a lot of unfair distribution of what schools get, even though they're saying that they're getting them and they're not getting them. And I know a couple of weeks ago, we talked to Eric Moore, and he was saying that there was these thousands and millions of dollars that had gone to my school within COVID funding, and no one had seen that money. There was still a lot more. There was a lot of pain within my school, and it's kind of hard to be at school, and that's why I'm out here, because I want to help get those resources to my school.
You're a student?
Yes, I'm a senior at South Lake Zareya.
And why are you out here supporting the teachers and the ESPs?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest thing is that I know that the teachers have been saying this, that they're really on the student side, but MPS, like, they keep trying to push this narrative that, like the teachers are, like, taking advantage of the students, and, like, they're just, like, basically, they paint them as, like, these, like, greedy, money-hungry, self-obsessed, like, people. Our teachers are, like, the basis of our community. Like, they really have done so much for every single kid in MPS, and we need to stop treating them like enemies. We need to stop like making them the antagonists of this story, like MPS is doing, because I know that they care about me and they love me, and that's why I'm here today. I need everyone else to know that as well.
I think for me, the experience for me, I've seen a lot of pain from not only with students, but with teachers and parents, and them wanting their kids to be in school and them wanting to get an education, but also teachers wanting to have, being paid fairly, and they want things that they deserve to have, and students want that just as much. Parents want that just as much. And so for me, it's been more of, I'm not really thinking about myself right now. I'm thinking more about my teachers, and it's kind of, I've put this narrative of, I'm not really worried about my education right now. I'm worried about the future of my education. I'm worried about, my niece and my nephew and their life and what they're going to be doing in schools. And I'm worried about my teachers, and I want them to get paid. I want them to have health insurance. I don't want them to miss out on these things that they deserve to have. And it's also, I'm feeling this pain of feeling like my education isn't worth being cared for, and it's not worth being paid enough for. It's not worth being funded for, because my teachers aren't babysitters. They're educators. They deserve to be paid enough, and they deserve to have everything that they need.
Well, like Zareya is saying, I think especially since like we're seniors, our education is almost finished. Like, we're actually almost at the end of the school year. So this isn't like necessarily, a lot of this is for the kids who are still in MPS and are going to be in MPS for like 13 more years, who are like going to join MPS next year. I don't know. It's been pretty awesome. When you're at school, it's hard. MPS, like, they wouldn't know this, but like when you're at school, especially our school's had like a lot of struggles this year, and like you can tell your peers are like suffering. Like, they really, really need like help, and they're not getting it. And it was just like, every single day is like the same. It's like dragging on, and like it's just each day is like a little bit more suffering layered on top of itself. And we couldn't keep doing that. Like, I'm not at all surprised that the strike happened, and I'm super duper proud of my teachers for doing that for themselves and for us. And especially like further like Black like colleagues who were like have been saying this for like fucking years and like have been like mistreated consistently and ignored like by their like white coworkers as well. So, but I'm glad like that this is like finally happening because it's long past time.
Okay, so I really appreciate that intro. I really loved the piece that you wrote, and it really gets into, I don't know if you have any familiarity with our podcast, but we started our podcast by critiquing a real estate project in North Minneapolis. They're redeveloping the Northside Riverfront. It's called the Upper Harbor Terminal. There's 48 acres of public land that got turned over to the wealthiest white people in the state, the Pohlad family, and they're working to create this real estate project. And we were critiquing that. So we, in our podcast then look at the power structure in the Twin Cities. And so we talk about foundations and we talk about kind of the ruling class versus the working class. And I really like the way that you brought that analysis into the realm of education. So, the way your piece started, I first encountered it. Somebody shared the Facebook post with me, and then I seen that Left Voice picked it up and published it. And you talk about having conversations with people on the picket line, and kind of the main question that you were investigating with your comrades is, why has the school district dug in its heels to do everything it can to resist union proposals that would plainly make education better for students and staff? This stuff seems common sense. More mental health for students. How could you be against that? And then what you do then is say, okay, let's look at it and let's do an analysis of what's happening. So the first layer you look at is the negotiating team for the district, right? So the way that a strike works or the way that collective bargaining works is the union sends a team of negotiators to the table and the district sends a team of negotiators to the table, right? And they kind of are the representatives of the two camps who hash things out. Can you talk about who is the negotiating team for the district and kind of what is their role? And why is it too simplistic to see them as like the real power holders in this situation?
Yeah. So the negotiating team on the district side is made up of kind of a motley crew of HR directors and executives and professionals, legal staff, and then other kind of executive or high-level staff. So there's associate superintendent. There's usually a principal or two on the negotiating team on the district side. And so they just kind of like gather a lot of kind of a representative sample of a lot of the top positions within the district and kind of plop them on the negotiating team. And it's usually, of course, each negotiating team has a kind of a lead negotiator. And they're usually the ones that are talking and the ones talking and negotiate in the negotiating sessions, the one kind of directing the flow. And on the district side, it's Maggie Sullivan. She's the director of HR, I believe, is her title.
Okay.
And she's been the main one, but there's also a number of the other kind of top executives who have been the ones kind of directing the flow. And so the negotiating team on the district side is kind of a really imposing force. A lot of them make six figures. My guess is all of them do, which is, 2 or 3 or 4 times what most ESPs make.
Right.
They've got just a lot of fancy dressing going on their side.
Yes, I understand. I noticed even the class divide in the district was very obvious. It's been obvious to me from living in the city, but I was over at the Davis Center interviewing people on the picket lines this week. And then I went inside the building to talk to some students who were protesting inside. And you really could see, you see the teachers and the ESPs outside that look like the working class, and then you go inside and you really see people buttoned up, you know what I'm saying? And it's posh. It's a real difference between the people who have these professional managerial class 6-figure jobs and then the ESPs who are making much less than that and doing the grunt work in the schools every day. And that's really that's class in our society that cuts across industry and sections of the economy, but it's a really glaring level of inequality.
Yeah, that's a super important piece of context to add to this conversation for sure. And we kind of return to your question about why has the negotiating team dug in its heels. Of course, that's kind of the main thrust of my kind of mini piece on this. But I think one way that a lot of people misread this is they instead of looking at a more material class-based analysis of the kind you kind of outlined, they look at they try to like psychologically analyze the actors on both sides.
Right.
And if you're just looking at the psychology of the negotiating team members, a lot of what they're doing can seem plainly irrational. If you ascribe to them the motives like, oh, they work for public school districts, their ultimate goal is to make public schools better. If that's like your orientation, and you're just looking at it from kind of these imagined psychological motives that the negotiating team on the district side has, you're gonna see what their actions as plainly irrational. And so that's a common refrain, even among union folks. Like, it's just like, oh, the district is being irrational again. If they would just like act in their own self-interest, and if they're just a little smarter, a little more enlightened, they would see the great benefit that would come from collaborating with the union more, or agreeing more with union demands. But I think that's just a totally misplaced analysis. It's not that these people are like trying to make public education better, but they just misunderstand things. It's like there's material interests and class conflicts underlying a lot of this that I think provides a much clearer picture and image of what's going on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we're going to like follow that thread as far as to identify those class interests. So you talk about the negotiating team, when they're pushed far enough, they'll say like, hey, look, we don't have the power to offer you more because the school district budget doesn't have that much room in it, you know? So you're like, okay, if we push past the negotiating team, let's go to the school board. The school board is the elected body that apparently or in theory governs and sets the rules for public education. Like if you push past the negotiating team, you might get to, well, maybe the school board are the people who have the real power in the system. Can you talk a little bit about the school board? Like who makes up the school board in Minneapolis? Kind of like what's their role in these, not only in these negotiations, but kind of how is their power limited in our system overall?
Yeah, totally. And just to draw that line again, like the negotiating team on the district side will almost universally say no to everything the union asks for. Just say no, 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 no. And of course, they'll do it in a way that sounds better than just saying no, but that's essentially what they do. And then, as you said, when you kick them hard enough, then they kind of pass the bill up to the school board and say, oh, we can't agree to these union proposals because the school board said we can't because we can't afford it.
Right.
And then for the school board, the school board is in many ways, it's a very diverse range of characters. But there is a structural aspect to all of it that kind of ties it together. Most of the school board members, they campaign on, because school board members in Minneapolis are elected. And that's not true of all school districts. In some school districts, they're appointed by like the mayor, for example. That's how it is in Chicago, for example. But in Minneapolis, the school board is elected. And so people are usually elected to the school board on the basis of, some kind of claim that they have ties to the community, or that they are, they can represent the community in some way. And so the people on the school board are kind of a mix of characters that kind of relate to the community in different ways that, is seen by the public to be important to public education. So usually there's a teacher or two on the school board. Usually there's like a few parents. Usually there's community leaders of various stripes and kinds. And they all campaign and run against each other for school board positions. And then they end up on the school board. But as I kind of point out in my piece, these positions, the people that end up on the school board are not, by and large, and maybe almost entirely, they're not high-level executive types. They don't have the background, the training, the specific expertise needed to run a school district directly.
Right.
The Minneapolis Public Schools, for example, has $1 billion, more than $1 billion running through it every year. Oof. And you just need a tremendous amount of, at least the way these kind of organizations are set up, you need a tremendous amount of like professionalized staff that can like read budgets, create projections, do all this kind of stuff, manage huge teams and departments and all this. And the school board plainly does not have the background to do that kind of work.
Right.
School board members get paid a part-time salary. They get paid about $20,000. I believe it's $20,000 a year, and all of them, as far as I know, all of them on the school board in Minneapolis have other main jobs, and so they're paid a little bit, but they're not paid at all to do like a full-time job, and it's kind of like a side thing for them.
Right.
And on the one hand, it's really hard. School board members oftentimes express either explicitly or implicitly how much work they're supposed to be doing, even though they don't get paid with it. And I can sympathize with the aspect that they don't get paid anything.
Right. It sounds familiar.
Yeah. On the other hand, like they are overseeing like the flow of billions of dollars through the city, and like the education of tens of thousands of students and the working conditions of tens of thousands of staff. And so the way the school board kind of ends up operating then is they hire the superintendent. There's a superintendents in Minneapolis have 3-year contracts, and the school board conducts the search for a superintendent whenever there's a new one, and they renew the contracts and they evaluate the superintendent according to certain criteria about whether they should rehire them or not. But once they hire the superintendent, it's mostly a hands-off job for most school board members. And it's the superintendent who then fills out a cabinet of professionalized executives, HR directives, financial gurus, that kind of stuff, top lawyers, legal counsels, and all these kind of top executives then run all these departments that then each have, of course, dozens of staff on their own. And for school board members that want to change things or maybe sympathize with the union's demands, it's just structurally there's a lot of obstacles in place for them to try to create the kind of change they might want to create for those who even want to create change. And I think a lot of them, have aspirations in that direction, but kind of materially are tied up in a way that prohibits them. But then there's usually a few school board members on each school board, at least the ones that since I've been paying close attention. There's usually a few school board members out of, I think it's total of 9. There's usually a few who kind of like go against the grain and regularly disagree with the superintendent and disagree with the majority of the school board. But they're fighting a real uphill battle because all the information they get is filtered through the superintendent's staff teams.
Right.
And so they don't have the expertise themselves to kind of independently gather a lot of data and analyze it and interpret it. I mean, they try their best, and that is what it is. But on the whole, they're just in a much weaker position to really go against the grain of the majority of the school board members and the and the superintendent.
Right. I mean, it's like, for context for listeners, you talk about this $1 billion public education budget and these elected positions who are part-time positions. If you contrast that with the city council is a full-time job and they make over $100,000 a year. And even they have a really hard time. They're not on equal footing with the staff at the city. There's a similar dynamic where really there's like a much bigger staff. The staff has like a orthodoxy and procedures that are really moving the city forward. And the city council kind of has some ornamental power mostly, but it's really a staff-driven organization. So if you think about the imbalance in the city when the city councilors, are full-time people making $100,000, it's even that much more exacerbated in the school district where you have this complex system, and then you have, people who are making a part-time salary and only allowed part-time hours to try to impact that. They're really structurally marginalized, and you really see that it is a staff-driven organization. That's the way it's set up, So like the democratic input from the school board lever is really not very powerful in its design that way. And you talk about then, the superintendent, and people have heard the name Ed Graff. Ed Graff is the superintendent who's sitting in that seat now, who really has a lot of power to, like you said, build out his cabinet and set the priorities. So it might be tempting to think, well, it's the superintendent who really has the power. But I think the really important piece of your analysis is to push past even that and say the superintendent is answerable to certain interests, and the superintendent is really there to represent certain interests. And you point to those interests and you say that, there's corporate power. There's the kind of like the local capitalist class, the ruling class, who really is weighing hard on the superintendent's priorities. Can you talk about that? Get into like the thrust of your piece when you keep peeling all these layers back. what role does kind of the corporate interest play in our politics around education, around budgets, around negotiations with the union, et cetera? And why? Why is it in their interest, to have their hands in these conversations?
Yeah. This is kind of the main conclusion I arrived at through my conversations with a lot of coworkers and throughout the strike, was just to kind of zero in on the motivations and the mechanisms of the way that kind of corporate power gets executed and expressed through the school system. And of course, these are critiques that, if you spend enough time reading articles from progressive news sources, you'll hear this critique kind of come through often enough. But I just still didn't have a good picture about how it all fit together. You can, it's easy to say that, sure, that, the ruling class or the wealthy in a society has a lot of the power, but then to kind of put all the pieces together was what I kind of wanted to struggle to do. And that's what I kind of tried to do with my piece. And so, but yeah, to flesh this out a little bit, in Minneapolis, so any urban area has a large concentration, of people who are workers, and then also, businesses and corporations and such. And on the corporate side, there's a large kind of block of, corporate interests or capital, whatever you want to call it. And in each city, this block of capital is kind of organized in different ways through different organizations. In Minneapolis, it seems like the main organization that kind of where a lot of these corporate interests kind of consolidate their power locally is through, at least on some issues, is through the Minneapolis Foundation. And one of the issues that the Minneapolis Foundation plays a large role in is education policy. So at least in education policy, the Minneapolis Foundation is kind of like where corporate power gets consolidated and then expressed outward from that site. I'm sure with different social issues, power might get exercised through different organizations in different ways, but at least for education, the Minneapolis Foundation is by far the dominant player. And so, to tease apart the Minneapolis Foundation a little bit more, it's it's the philanthropic arm of the local corporate elite, basically. And a good deal of where their money goes is, various charity-based things. They give money to the park board, they give money to museums, and they give money to social and very social issues, and to deal with homelessness and all this other stuff. Some of that's fine, whatever. Right. And it's not a bad thing, that people give money to help people out. But it's all cloaked and kind of framed and encapsulated within this container. And in this container of charity kind of exists alongside this container of aggressive public policy lobbying. Yes. And so a lot of the biggest grants that the Minneapolis Foundation gives out are for quote unquote advocacy organizations. And these advocacy organizations are the ones that drive the public policy discussions and framework within the city in a lot of ways, and especially in public education. And so, for example, the Minneapolis Foundation, almost every nonprofit organization in Minneapolis that does policy work and research and advocacy in public education has some tie to the Minneapolis Foundation, some direct financial tie, either through direct grant funding, indirect grant funding, and then obviously just the broader network of consultants and researchers and lobbyists that they have. And I think one kind of mistake that of this critique that gets made oftentimes is that they see this kind of corporate influence as having more to do with certain issues on the kind of the boundaries of public education. They talk about charter schools. Charter schools are kind of in some ways, part of, but also not part of public education. They're kind of on the side a little bit. But I think what I tried to focus on in my piece is that the Minneapolis Foundation and their agenda is deeply rooted in the very heart of the way public education is run in Minneapolis. And so I kind of outlined a few different of the main kind of foundational policies that Minneapolis Public Schools has carried out over the last few years to try to illustrate this point. So, for example, the CDD is called the Comprehensive District Design. It was a redesign of the entire school district's programming, changing school district or school boundaries, changing programming, changing bus routes, changing enrollment patterns. It really reshuffled a lot of the district. And school districts do these kind of big redesigns from time to time. And, there's nothing inherently wrong with trying to like shuffle things around to make it better. But when you kind of peel back the layers and start to look like, oh, who's benefiting from this? Where are resources going? What's going on? What does the community think? Was the community given buy-in or participation in this process? It starts to become clear that this was a very top-down policy, the CDD in Minneapolis. And there was the whatever mechanisms of community engagement there were very, very thin, and provided a thin veneer of support for what was largely a very top-down policy. And if you look at the organizations that pushed for the CDD, all of them that I'm aware of have direct financial ties to the Minneapolis Foundation. They all get grants from the Minneapolis Foundation, stuff like that. And it's helpful to be able, or one way you can kind of see these ties is through the tax filings of the Minneapolis Foundation. So if you go to the Minneapolis Foundation website, you can go to their 990 IRS tax filings and see, and in these tax filings, they're required to, divulge where they give money to. And, it's a very long list of organizations they give grants to. They give out about $125 million of grants a year. But you can start to pick apart, like, oh, they give money to this foundation, and this advocacy organization. And kind of importantly, the second biggest grant recipient of the Minneapolis Foundation in 2021 was an organization called Great Minnesota Schools, which is like essentially like a lobbying arm and support organization for charter schools in the Twin Cities. And they also kind of like fund a lot of things related to privatization and organizations like the Minnesota Parents Union, which I discussed in my post a little bit.
Could you say your name for us?
Britt Anderson.
Awesome. And what's your relationship to the strike?
I'm a teacher.
And why are you out on strike?
For so many reasons. For mental health, for our ESPs to get paid a living wage, to retain teachers of color so our students have teachers who look like them. That's so important. Because I feel like this is not just about Minneapolis Public Schools this year. This is about the future of public schools. And public schools don't have the resources they need, and we've got to fight for that.
Absolutely. Huge respect to y'all. What's the experience been like being on strike?
It's exhausting. I never thought I'd be as tired as I am. I'm walking like 20,000 steps a day just out on the line. Yeah. There's a great sense of community, and we feel support from other unions and from community members. But it's a lot. We never thought we'd be out here this long.
Don't know what to say.
Are you on strike?
Yes,
okay.
yeah.
What's your role?
I'm an ESP. I'm a behavior dean at a middle school.
Hell yeah, that's awesome. What are ESPs fighting for?
Basically the same thing everyone else here is for. The teachers, counselors, social workers are all getting behind us, fighting for a living wage, which would be $35,000 a year minimum.
At least.
At least, exactly, which a lot of us are not getting now, so.
What's the experience of being on strike been like for you?
It's been a weird mix of frustration that we've had to get to this point, and obviously solidarity when you see hundreds and thousands of people all together.
Hell yeah, and like what, if someone was thinking they wanted to, what do you say to keep people holding the line?
Oh gosh. Honestly, take it a day at a time. That's what I've been doing, and resting when you need to.
Absolutely. Well, salute to you all. Huge solidarity. How about could you say your name for us?
Yeah, my name is Nick Cross.
And what brings you out today?
I'm a school social worker here in Minneapolis, and we're out here fighting for smaller class sizes, more mental health support, and pay equity for our staff.
That's awesome. So you're here in solidarity with your coworkers.
Yeah, and my kids. My kids go to Minneapolis as well.
That's awesome. What do ESPs mean to you?
They mean everything. They are what glue the holds the building together. They're with the kids all the time. They're the ones who are on the front lines giving our kids love, and the ones that are getting hit and bit and kicked out by our kids, and so they deserve a living wage and more.
I was interested, can you say a little bit more about that Minnesota Parents Union? It's like these corporate interests are really good at kind of like astroturfing, you know, like even the name Great Minnesota Schools, like who's going to argue against that, you know, but you have to like dig through the kind of the branding to look at like what are their actual policy positions, kind of like what is the Minnesota Parents Union?
Yeah, so the Minnesota Parents Union is an organization that on the surface advocates for, you know, good schools for marginalized populations. But what they actually do is a lot of what they actually do is just disrupt and attack public education in various ways. One of the main ways they do that is they're constantly attacking unions, educator unions. So they show up at educator unions rallies and press conferences and like heckle and are very aggressive oftentimes, and just try to cause as much commotion as possible. And anyway, it's a huge, not a huge, but it's just a stressful thing for trying to organize in public education, trying to make it better when you have types like the Minnesota Parents Union people coming in and constantly just like, they're, in my opinion, they're essentially professional harassers most of the time.
That's how I've seen them operate too. You know, I've seen some of the characters involved over the years, and they have switched which issue they're passionate about depending on where the corporate money is flowing, and then really take a bullying, belligerent attitude towards public life. And it's really like just like plainly astroturfed, you know, like, yeah, where it's like it's not a real grassroots organization. It's corporate money that's come down to like create this fake opposition to the teachers union and educators union.
Yeah, and it's kind of curious to me how this plays out, at least in kind of speculating about the internal politics of the Minneapolis Foundation. Like, so different cities, kind of like the ruling elite of different cities usually has slightly different orientations, different politics. In more, for example, conservative parts of the country, the ruling elite locally will oftentimes be much more like, you know, behind the Republican Party or behind, you know, certain parts of the Republican Party, and will kind of push in a more openly like right-wing way.
Right.
The Minneapolis Foundation, like as a corporate bloc, is more kind of like the quote unquote like liberal corporate bloc. They're not backing Republicans for office. They're kind of they mostly back Democrats, even though I'm sure they back Republicans too. But they don't wash themselves or immerse themselves entirely like an extreme right-wing politics, which is what, you know, more right-wing corporate elites do. And so it's interesting that the Minneapolis Foundation is providing money to an organization like Minnesota Parents Union, because the Minnesota Parents Union is so far to the right in education policy that it's just kind of interesting that as a more liberal corporate elite, they would be funding such a more explicitly right-wing program. What are we to make of that? I guess is an interesting question. And this is kind of just a line of reasoning, but like, well, if they're giving money indirectly, Minneapolis Foundation gives money indirectly to the Minnesota Parents Union through the Great Minnesota Schools organization. And, you know, whatever the reason why, it's certainly true that whatever that Minneapolis Foundation or that the Minnesota Parent Union is serving the interests of those providing the money in some form. But then also the Minneapolis Foundation gives a lot of money to other, you know, education organizations that have much more liberal kind of like pseudo progressive like veneer. And so it's just interesting that the corporate elite would choose to kind of fund both more explicitly right-wing public education organizations like the Minnesota Parents Union, while simultaneously kind of funding like this more like pseudo progressive education advocacy orgs that are also, I think, trying to privatize public education and attacking it and undermining it, but doing it more from like a pseudo-progressive politics. And how that all comes together in the Minneapolis Foundation is just a kind of like an interesting question to think about. And I think the Minnesota Parents Union hasn't been around a long time, and it seems like it was created. And I'm just curious what block of capital locally, if it's the same one that's funding, or is it somehow different than the rest of the rich elite interests that are funding the Minnesota Parents Union. But no matter who the direct contributors are, it's all kind of being funneled through the influence of the Minneapolis Foundation. And these are the kind of questions that I kind of try to roll over in my head to see if there's any way to peek behind the curtain. But in some cases, it's all too opaque or all kind of too hidden to really be able to get a firm answer on.
Yeah, but I think you did a great job. And I think even sometimes it's like there's the specifics that are hard to get to, but there's some simple truths. And I think one of them is to recognize that, like you said, there's the really hard right, reactionary, openly racist wing of capital in our country. You know what I'm saying? And then there's the liberal wing of capital. But it's important for us to understand that, like, that's still a right-wing position. You know what I'm saying? Like, the Democratic Party is a capitalist party. You talk about how, our school board is dominated by Democrats, much like our city is dominated by Democrats at the city council level. And we have some of the worst inequalities in the country. We have a vicious, violent police force that the Democratic Party refuses to hold accountable, and that the Democratic Party is an arm of the capitalist class. At the end of the day, it's a right-wing party, not just like the GOP, but much like the GOP, with different branding and different flavor. I think you pointed to the Target Corporation. Target is one of these ruling class interests that's very connected to the Minneapolis Foundation. Target has their own foundation, but they also give through the Minneapolis Foundation. And you could kind of do this analogy of, like, you could compare Target to Walmart. Everybody knows Walmart family is right-wing and really Christian and conservative, and it kind of has that branding. And then Target has this nicer veneer, right? It's supposed to be like somehow substantively different than Walmart. But you name that, Target is viciously anti-union. You know what I'm saying? Their business is built on breaking a unionized workforce. So, and the city attorney, formerly of Minneapolis, is the head of labor relations for Target, who is on record. There's videos of him doing union busting work. So you realize that, like, there's the precedent is that the ruling class, whether they be the liberal branded or conservative branded, do not want a strong working class, do not want the precedent of a unionized workforce. And the neoliberal project of capital in the last 30 years has been specifically to break public sector unions. They've done such a good job breaking private sector unions. And that's why teachers union are public enemy number one for the ruling class. It's a way to attack the whole notion of a public good, of a public sector, and of a unionized workforce. So I think that, like, I'm really was glad that you named Target in particular, because we have an episode of our podcast that details how deeply intertwined Target is with the local police state. They ran a downtown surveillance program that literally created a list of black youth who were not allowed in downtown. They ran a network of closed loop surveillance cameras, and they were literally, if they saw somebody, they were arresting them. They put money into putting extra prosecutors in the Hennepin County Attorney's Office, which really, really, really boosted the incarceration rates in Minneapolis. They work with the FBI, and the Minneapolis Foundation was one of the first groups that most publicly ran to the defense of the MPD in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. So these things are connected, and I really, really appreciate the way you brought him into the conversation around education, because we've been tracing the lines in terms of real estate. CPED is the staff at the city, the department in the city that deals with the real estate projects. And if you look into it, it's really a revolving door from the private real estate industry into city government, and they follow the orthodoxy of the capitalist real estate market. And I really think there's a parallel there with the school district, as far as, like, if you keep drawing the lines back, it's really like the ruling class. And I like the fact that you got concrete. We're not being conspiratorial. You can really see that these big corporate interests are flooding money to kind of shape the politics. Another piece that you talked about was, like, the language of efficiency. Can you talk about how, how that language gets used and how we can kind of see through that?
Yeah, and I super appreciate you providing that wider context and bringing things back to, like, the similarities and the shared project of the Republican and Democratic Party. I think that's absolutely crucial. And yeah, so efficiency is kind of the buzzword of most corporate education reformers and privatization efforts, and just efforts that generally try to bring public schools into line with certain model of education based on the interests of the ruling class. And so efficiency, the way it's kind of weaponized in this context is is against everything that the unions are asking for and that the workers are asking for in this fight between Minneapolis Public Schools and the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers. And one of the ways that efficiency has kind of been most sharply weaponized is by kind of over the last 10 years. One of the biggest talking points of these ed reformers is that more money for public education is not the solution. And so, for example, Bill Gates is kind of at the national level, kind of one of the main education reform kind of gurus he's kind of seen as in that community. And he kind of repeatedly publishes articles and funds think tanks and all this kind of stuff, trying to show that school districts that spend more money on education actually don't do a better job on schools that spend less money on education. The solution is not more money, according to Bill Gates and that crew. The solution is, better accountability and more like efficiency and market mechanisms to make public education more efficient. Which is, once you think about it a little more, it's kind of total nonsense.
Exactly.
Everything that the union is asking for that would make schools better has a cost to it. Smaller class size if you hire more staff, more living wages for ESPs, mental health supports for students. All this stuff has a cost to it. And the education reform crowd is just really intent on trying to dissociate that thing, trying to say that, money doesn't matter. We can cut funding for public education, and that's fine. What really matters is making everything competitive and market oriented. And so the word efficiency is used to kind of tie all these threads together. And in a really perverted way that really is seductive on the one hand, because in a capitalist society, the value of efficiency is kind of in many ways paramount. And a lot of people without trying to kind of buy into this logic that public schools should be more efficient. We should run public schools like we run Target, there should be, very top down, very all these metrics to measure everything and then discard those people and things that are not quote unquote efficient. And it just creates a lot of havoc. And so I feel like in a lot of ways, this fight between the union and the school district right now is a fight over, efficiency on the one side and public good on the other. And a public good to be well run needs to be really actually funded. And that's kind of in many ways where the struggle is at.
Absolutely. I really appreciate that. I feel like we've all been so beat over the head with the conservative messaging that ooh, big government and you can't spend. And that is pure bullshit. You know what I'm saying? We should be investing money in our students, in our schools, in our health, in our public sector. It takes money and we have the money and we should spend it. It's that whole corporate efficiency language really needs to be attacked. I really appreciated that. I want to tell a little story you just reminded me of when you say we should run schools like Target. I used to work at Ann Sullivan Anishinaabe in South Minneapolis, a public school. And I remember being so upset because they got a grant from Target to revamp the library, right? And what they did is they kind of remodeled the library and put new books in there. But Target chose all the books that got to go in the library. They painted Target logos all over the library. And on the day that the library opened, they made the teachers wear Target uniforms to work. So all the teachers wore khakis and red shirts. And I was sitting there in the school feeling crazy. Can y'all not see that this is damn near fascist? Target should not be choosing which books our students read. Our teachers should not be dressed like Target employees, And it's wow. And I think you made a great point in your piece, just stating plainly that a lot of this is just about taxes, that corporations don't want to pay taxes. They want to limit their taxes as much as possible. And if we're going to have good schools, we got to tax corporations, and we should. Somebody like Target, it's $1 billion corporation that just is so much money. And even the idea that the money that goes to the Minneapolis Foundation is money that should have been taxed. That's a tax shelter that they put this money in the foundation. So just that simple point is in a lot of ways, it boils down to our ability as a people to tax these corporations and use that money for the public good, which we absolutely should do. What brings you out today?
Well, as part of MFT, I'm on strike for better education for our kids because we might think, Minneapolis is an urban city, their kids aren't worth it, but the kids are just as worth it as they are in the suburbs.
Absolutely. What's your role in MPS?
I'm an associate educator, so an ESP. I work helping out the different classrooms, but there aren't enough of us, There needs to be able to be more of us so that we can help more kids because they all need help.
Absolutely. Can you say, what's the experience of being on strike been like for you?
It's definitely really stressful. I mean, it definitely hit me this weekend. I miss my kids, I'd rather be teaching right now, but unless we get the things that we need for our kids, we can't do that.
Absolutely. Can I ask one more question? What does it mean for you to see the teachers out on strike with you all and supporting you?
I think it reminds us that we are together in this, that we can't be divided because really we're all working for the kids.
Hey, thank you so much. Huge respect to you. ESPs are my heroes. Hell yeah. Hey, could you say your name for the podcast?
Yeah, I'm Joel Lopez, a.k.a. DJ Low.
And what's your relationship to the strike?
I work in special education, so I am direct contact with the students every day.
So you're an ESP?
ESP, that is correct.
And what are y'all fighting for, ESPs?
Man, safe, stable schools. We want more just help, resources. There isn't enough support. We ask for support from our admin, but we don't get it from them. We ask the district for more help. We don't get that. We don't get the resources we need. One of my coworkers, one of the teachers, he wasn't able to get iPads for the students until halfway through the school year, but that was not given from the district. It was given because it was found in a room that was vacant. Wow. And we're not there's resources that can be had, but we're not being able to have it. That also our middle school kids, Sanford Middle School, where I work at, they don't have a playground. They just have a yard and trenches. They're not funding our students. The lunches, the food has gone down. Now we have where kids have different type of dietary needs, gluten-free, this and that. We should be having that for our kids. This is 2022, and there's not enough food for the kids to go ahead and eat something good. And many times, many of these schools are places where students can go ahead and get that food. I even got word, and that's confirmed, about Anderson wasn't having at the start of the school year in 2021, 2022, that they didn't have hot lunches for the kids. Wow. Wow. So, this is why we're out here. We're demanding more. When the superintendent asked and got a raise of 26% within the past 6 years, while teachers got a 6% and ESPs like myself got maybe a 3% in the last 6 years. This is unacceptable. This is why we're out here. On the top of the district, it is messy, it is corrupt, and we're shining the light.
Hey, beautiful. Big respect, bro. Thank you so much. Hell yeah. Can you talk about with this analysis laid out, how do we move forward? You know what I'm saying? What can we do to counter this corporate power, and how does this analysis kind of inform you all who are on strike and us in the community who want to support you?
Yeah, I think this is kind of the important follow-up question that I didn't speak directly to in my piece. At least I kind of mentioned it in passing a little bit. And I think it differs a lot issue by issue how to attack corporate power as it's expressed through the government and the state and the school board and the city council and such. For education, public education takes place primarily within specific workplaces, within school buildings. And so that gives workers a tremendous lever over the way that public education is conducted. And of course, the strike that we're seeing right now is a really big example of that, kind of workers using their orientation to the workplace as a lever of power against the kind of corporate interests that kind of loom over us. And I think this gets complicated and kind of cloudy when we start analyzing things like the Minneapolis Foundation, all these kind of diffuse interests that kind of bear down on the public education system. I think some people, when they see these things, they start to come up with strategies that I think are not going to be the most helpful in attacking corporate interest in public education. For example, Minneapolis Foundation has offices in Minneapolis, downtown Minneapolis. And I think, to me, a superficial way to look at this analysis would be to say that, oh, if the Minneapolis Foundation is, corrupting our schools and defunding and all this kind of stuff, we should go picket at the Minneapolis Foundation. And maybe that's not a bad idea, but I just think as education workers, we don't have any specific lever at the Minneapolis Foundation offices itself. It's not like we don't have any special relationship to that where we can kind of use our position in society to kind of pry open and put pressure on them by picketing outside. I'm kind of working through this, but I think, as educators and as workers, we have much more, our lever of power is really the workplace and the school. And so to attack the Minneapolis Foundation, I think there's a lot of ways to think creatively about that, but I'm also really skeptical about approaches that kind of try to take the worker out of the equation, that tries to take the worker's relationship to the workplace out of the equation. I think that's still a super important part of it. And so I'm still much more committed to the idea of having the pickets at the schools where people work, where their communities are organic and the relationships are strong, and where people can talk about the issues that are affecting them and how they can do these kind of things, and kind of stay rooted in the community and stay rooted in the schools where we're at, and try to find a way to exercise power from that point. And I think, again, there's not just one way to do it. There's a lot of different ways to do that. But when we start kind of getting too far away from the source of our power, kind of trying to pick it outside of the Minneapolis Foundation offices, are we really disrupting anything there? Are we, is bringing public attention to this in this way really helping the struggle in any way? And I think I'm kind of, critical when we get too far away from what gives workers a particular lever of power over the struggle. And I haven't figured it all out. I think a lot of people, when they see the Minneapolis Foundation as and see how all these things tie together, they try to think of ways to attack the Minneapolis Foundation directly. And maybe there's some merits to that. On the other hand, the Minneapolis Foundation doesn't attack public education directly. It's not like some staff person from the Minneapolis Foundation comes into my classroom and takes away kids, resources. Right. They exercise their power through a bunch of different channels and indirectly. And I think we have to be equally as nuanced and analytical and strategic in our analysis of how to fight back against the Minneapolis Foundation. I don't think, just as for them, it's not as simple as sending a staff person into my classroom to take away resources. It's not as simple to attack the Minneapolis Foundation as it is to go directly to their offices and put up a picket outside. I think the strategic questions get complex, but I think in maintaining an orientation to where worker power comes from and how it can be exercised, I think has to be central to that analysis and that strategy.
I love that. I really appreciate you laying that out clearly, because I think hopefully I don't mean to speak flippantly about this strike as far as it's just this inspirational thing for me, because I know that it takes a lot of sacrifice and courage, and nobody wants to go on strike. But on the other side of that, it is inspirational. And I think one of the things it can really teach us is about the power of workers. And you talk about the special power of the workplace. That's where workers have power. You run the schools. If you don't have the educators, there's no schools. And that's the logic of class struggle, right? Workers make the world go round. So so maybe a way to, attack the Minneapolis Foundation is to look at the workforces of the corporations that fund the Minneapolis Foundation. Maybe we could have a conversation in the future. I'd love to talk to you more. I worked in nonprofits most of my adult life, and we unionized the nonprofit that I worked at right before I left. And there was a rash of nonprofit unionization campaigns over this last couple years in Minneapolis. And I know a lot of the grievances came down to how can we collectively fight back against these foundations, And I know that's complex because nonprofit workers are a little different, but just that's what came up in my mind when you laid that out. Is there anything else you want to say to our listeners before we get off? I just want to say today, this weekend, you all are voting on the tentative agreement that came to on Friday. So we don't know if the strike is going to continue tomorrow or not. So we don't, when people listen to this, you know, they'll know what happened, but we won't. But I think this conversation is valuable either way, if the strike continues or if the strike is concluded. Anything else you want to say?
Yeah, I think so. The tentative agreement that came through for ESPs is really controversial. Some people think it's a really good tentative agreement. I personally think it's a very uninspiring tentative agreement, but the voting is going on right now, and we'll know by the end of the night today whether it passes or not. And hopefully, whether the tentative agreement passes or not, hopefully those of us who are involved in this fight can keep it going and not forget what we started the fight for.
Hell yeah. Well, Max, thanks so much for coming on. We'll link to your piece, and we'll also link to the strike funds in the show notes if it's still going on. You know, and I really implore listeners to support public schools, to support the ESPs, to support the students. This is like a really important moment in the history of this city and our country. I think it's really, I'm so encouraged and inspired by the educators who made this sacrifice for the students and the families and for themselves, who are like really pointing the way in the class struggle. So huge hats off to you, Max, and your comrades. Big salute. Thanks for joining us. Money, power, land, solidarity.
We need money, land.